And thank you for that. All right, so Steve McMaster, I've been with Dell Technologies right at 20 years, a little bit over 20 years now. Been doing a bunch of stuff, sales roles, management roles, but I've been aligned for Microsoft Complex Solutions for about 7 or 8 years now, supporting a bunch of different roles, but I really went back deep into the technology a few years ago. And the conversation that we're going to be talking about today was kind of a oh my moment that a lot of us had about 9 months ago. And it very specifically has to do with SQL. This conversation, Microsoft meeting, we're going to be talking about SQL. But it's not just about SQL, it's about data. And what we were recognizing was, we heard about SQL 19 and we knew what was coming and the things in it. And you know, Buck Woody and Bob Ward, they all had their sessions. I'm not going to replicate those sessions. Fantastic individuals. Goodness, they just run circles around me. But when we started looking at what was coming, we recognized this is as big of a change focused around data as really when virtualization was kicked off like 18, 19 years ago. I remember VMware was coming out with the virtualization technology, and I was selling servers at Dell at the time, and we were running around like Keystone Cops. It was really silly. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. We're not going to sell as many servers. What are we going to do? Our IDC numbers are going to go down. And then we recognized, well, this is something that you need to embrace, and we did. And we didn't sell as many servers that first year, but we sold bigger, beefier, higher profit servers, so we were kind of okay with that. But that virtualization wave that happened changed, well, you're still dealing with it now, right? That next wave is happening right now, and hardly anybody's aware of it. So we're going to talk about that here today, is that we're seeing all of the different big players, Microsoft, Dell, VMware is part of Dell, Oracle. I mean, did any of you guys go to Dell Technology World at the beginning of the year? Or you may have seen the picture of where we had CEO of VMware, CEO of Dell, CEO of Microsoft, all up there, you know, with Pat and Mike and Satya all handshaking, right? And you're like, Microsoft, VMware. This is like Ghostbusters, right? Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. I can't believe that I'm seeing this. And the reality is that's our reality. And so we saw that over the last couple of years with even Microsoft embracing open infrastructure, right? When you look at the virtual machines that are being run in Azure, I mean, that groundswell has already tipped over into non-Microsoft Windows Server-based architectures, right? It's like more than half of them are off of that open infrastructure. And then you see the acquisition of Git and his embracing of this technology. The recognition is that this is a fully multi-cloud world. And then not just Azure and AWS and Google, but all the private cloud and hybrid cloud details within that. And there's not just one single answer to this. And Microsoft, interestingly, has been embracing that. And you see that with the announcements that happened on Monday with Synapse and Arc, this idea of intelligent edge. And Satya kicked that off actually a couple of years ago with the focus around intelligent edge. And I got a couple of his slides there. But it's a multi-cloud world, but the fundamental focus in all this is data. And I'm not talking about SQL, I'm just talking about just data. Data is where all these things are revolving around. And we recognize that there's a lot of things that drive that on why data is the fulcrum in which the entire seesaw of the world is pivoting right now. And that's driven around people and processes and technologies. And those have been historically limitations in the past as well. I could easily put up politics, right? So all of you are learning about all this new cool stuff, and you're like, I want to go implement it, but I can't because I've got internal political limitations, right? We got infrastructure people that aren't listening to the DBAs. They're not listening to the data scientists, or they'll kind of listen, but they'll kind of also give them the Heisman and say, yes, but we're doing this. And the epical change is happening right now is forcing all of us to think about this different. Now, there's 3 big things that we recognize that made us do our full stop. Again, about 9 months ago. It's really when it hit us kind of this area here. Okay, Tommy Boy reference there. But it just really hit us in the face, right? Where it made us kind of stop and think. Okay, so the first is the idea of data gravity. What is data gravity? Well, just like when we were growing up and we learned about Isaac Newton and the apple, data has weight. I mean, not literally. It doesn't have mass. But it kind of does when you think about it. Because When data is created, we find over and over again that data tends to remain where it is. The ability for us to move data and munch data together with these big ETL offload events, it gets painful, it gets expensive. The idea of having to put all the data in just a common data lake in some instances sounds great, but it's completely different architectures, modality, languages, structured versus unstructured. It might sound easy, sometimes it's hard. And what we find is silos of data are existing all over the place. And you're already familiar with this, especially if you run different architectures within your environment. You could have a great big SQL data farm. You might also have SAP and Oracle within your infrastructure as well. And oh, by the way, there's a little thing called unstructured data, IoT data, image data, Hadoop architectures. I got Cloudera architectures. And you're like, wouldn't it be great if I could access all that data? But the reality is that there's these walls, these silos, to where if I'm a SQL guy that's been using T-SQL, which by the way is the most common language, SQL is the most commonly distributed databases out there, how do I access the Oracle stuff without doing some kind of really expensive migration event and porting stuff over? And how the heck do I get to Hadoop? And what we recognize is that these silos of data gravity islands, specifically around the edge, we find that with manufacturing and oil and gas and retail stores, I mean, the data tends to remain there, is that there's an embracing of that intelligent edge idea. You see that with Microsoft with Azure Stack, right? DataBox Edge was just renamed Azure Stack Edge. The ability for me to recognize that that data needs to remain at the production facility there. I need to do my machine learning there. But I need to be able to access that data holistically. And so that brings us to the next idea, which is data virtualization. This is not virtual machines. So a lot of people just think, well, we already know. No, this is different. How many are familiar with SQL and Polybase? All right, so hopefully all of you will get a better understanding in the next few seconds here. Polybase is effectively a translator. It's more complicated than that, but that's what it is. Let me give you a scenario. In that scenario, let's say I'm a T-SQL DBA guy, and I'm comfortable and familiar and been using SQL all the way, even before 2008. And then there's a unstructured Hadoop architecture where I got really, really smart guys. They never open the door. We slide pizzas underneath they put some newspaper in the corner in case they have an accident. Really, really smart guys working on Hadoop infrastructure. They speak a different language than me. I mean, we used to teasingly call them cone heads. They kind of would speak their own meet language. I'm being facetious here. But there wasn't a lot of communication there. With Polybase, which used to be on that old APS analytics platform system, that turnkey is like a refrigerator you'd buy from Dell and Microsoft, had a tool called Polybase where you could put a query in T-SQL. Polybase would carry that over to an unstructured architecture like Hadoop, redefine that in a language that Hadoop could understand. Hadoop would do its data processing, provide the answer back to you, translates back into T-SQL, and you're like, Eureka, I have access now to Hadoop data in a way I never did. And Microsoft took Polybase and they put it in the SQL license starting in SQL 2016. So if you're doing SQL 16 or later, you have Polybase. It's a tool that you can use today. And that's great from that Hadoop perspective. And not a lot of people were doing it, but the technology was there. In SQL 2019, which by the way just launched on Monday, we recognized that they just injected a whole bunch of steroids into Polybase. With Polybase, I can access almost all the data. I can access Oracle, I can access SAP, I can leverage Spark, I can access Hadoop. The whole idea that you see around Synapse, right, from an Azure cloud perspective, having a massive data lake around structured and unstructured data is that same basic idea. Using Parquet and Polybase, and again, we can go way in the weeds on that discussion, but access to all the data. As a matter of fact, I carry a little sticker around that I've been handing out for laptops. This is contraband. By the way, this is not a Dell issued thing. But how many of you have seen the all the things meme, right? It's a little stick figure carrying all the things. It says, containerize all the things. Data is democratized, meaning everybody has access to the data using traditional T-SQL language scripts. So I can write an app or I can write an analytics engine. Polybase can be my interface to go access all that data and pull it into things like big data clusters or things like that from a Synapse point of view. That technology is now super enabled. Do you have a question? There's a mic right there if we want to pick you up on audio.
Is there anything about the performance delay on the poly?
Oh, there's an overhead, sure. Yeah, it's not just speed of light, but yeah, there's a translation that has to happen. But is there a performance delay was the question. Yes, there's an overhead. However, I get access to data. In the past, I was, open, I want in, and they couldn't get in, right? Now, what's happening is that data still remains where it is. I have access to it, so instead of it being a silo, think of it more like a hedge between neighbors, and I'm reaching over and I'm handshaking that data. And again, there's a big conversation I'd be happy to have after this, because this is only 45 minutes, where we can talk about the things that the SQL 2019 Big Data Cluster team is doing to take advantage of that. But when we recognize that, we're like, okay, there's three things that are happening. Data gravity, the ability for me to access all that data, and oh, by the way, the little meme I was just showing you, containerize all the things. Containerization is no longer a science experiment. It is running production. Some of the biggest automotive manufacturers in the world are running full production around containerized solutions today. And that is a thing that's kind of crept up on us, because this whole idea of containerization, and we'll talk about containerization here in a minute in a little bit more detail, is the big epical change where all of these things are coming together. They all kind of pull together to such a way that if I put my Stephen Covey hat on, it's the new paradigm. And it's crept up upon us in a way that we never really thought about before. It's to the point where we need to disengage and rotate and then re-engage and just think different about how we're addressing that data, because all three of these things are self-supporting. And what I mean about a holistic approach is containerization can run pretty much anywhere. I mean, you don't look where you can run it, you actually look where you can't run it, because those are the instances that prove my statement where it's holistic. Meaning that traditional three-tier architectures that are running SAN technology using the CSI plugin, I have the ability to run containerized and persistent storage targets within those architectures. I can do it with converged and hyper-converged infrastructures using containerization, Kubernetes orchestration on top of that. Like from an Azure Stack perspective, I can use AKS. Right, from an Azure perspective. From a VMware perspective with vSAN and with VX, I can run PKS on that. Heck, I can even throw this up into AWS and use their EKS. And so the idea that you see specifically around Azure Arc is the ability for me to do all of these PostgreSQL and SQL data warehouse engagements on anything that can support a container, which is becoming almost everything. So it then becomes not so much of a, how many of you had the experience where you're working with Dell and Dell comes out talking about a new technology and immediately you're like, oh, son of a gun, I'm going to have to forklift this, I'm going to migrate that, I still got 3 years left on this, I'm not quite ready for that. I get it, I've been selling for 20 years. The idea now, though, is that I can do it on all the things, including stuff that you're probably already running today and using the infrastructure enablement technologies there. Again, it's making us all think different. Because you're like, my architecture is this. Will it work? Probably yes. I don't know what your architecture is, but let's talk about it. All of these things are making us think fundamentally different. So as you think about the existing infrastructure and private and public and hybrid cloud and all this, the underlying technologies of the enablement from this DevOps idea and cloud native and all the things that are happening around digital transformation and IT transformation, infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, and all these as a service, as a service ideas are enablement technologies that we find that are keyed around these two basic ideas, data virtualization and containerization, to where I can have a common architecture. We have a case study on this at Dell, where we have a common architecture running both Oracle and SQL. Now I can run SQL 2019 on it, completely sequestered in the SAN. They don't see each other at all within the PowerMax infrastructure, but over the top I can use SQL 2019 and Polybase to go consume that Oracle infrastructure. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy ways that I can do this. It's just an instance that we showed. And the embracing of that new technology is something that we decided we had to do. So it's a journey that all of you are on right now, because this isn't even the end point. We get into more containerization stuff as we look over the horizon. But for many customers who are still looking at this, I still have SQL 2008. And end of support was, what, 3 months ago on that? And it still is, I think, over half of all install base is 2008 and older. And you're like, why? And you're like, well, I got app dependencies and analytics dependencies. I can't move it, right? And there's all kinds of compatibility engines we can run in SQL 2019 where we can make that problem go away. As people start migrating to this idea of SQL likes to be virtualized. So I can run it bare metal, and a lot of people did, but I can run it on top of a hypervisor, and I can take advantage of all kinds of nimble performance things, whether it's vSphere or Hyper-V. What we're finding is the next step of enablement here on the far right has to do around Docker containers. Doesn't have to be Docker, but it seems like everybody's going on the Docker route. And some type of an orchestrator, and it seems to be Kubernetes is the direction everybody's going. The idea around how I can strip off all of that overhead, and almost in your mind, think of it almost like they're SQL VMs. In other words, they're not vSphere or Hyper-V virtual machines running some type of, almost think of SQL as being its own self-included architecture, running a really thin version of Linux and being super nimble. And I can run that either directly down on the OS, or we've seen a huge amount of value of running containers on top of a hypervisor. Because one of the things that's happening in this wild, wild west of containerization, and I mean, it's almost like Red Dead Redemption, right? Everybody's walking around with a 6-shooter, you know, this open technology, right? The idea of it is that everybody's doing this container idea, but at some point you have to recover. You know, the whole Burris story, backup, recovery, archive is still a big play. And doing things like, and you can barely see the dotted line. I don't know if I have I have a little, see if it shows up here. Oh man, you can just barely see that laser. See that little dotted line? The persistent volumes running on top of Kubernetes connected back to the architecture that it's running on is super important. That's where the plugins with container instances with CSI from traditional architectures comes into play. The AKS, the EKS, the PKS interfaces here. Because when we have a conversation like I was having 2 days ago with Buck, he was like, if you don't get the storage right from the start, you're going to be in trouble. And that's super important for us, obviously, from a Dell EMC and Dell Technologies point of view, because this idea of the infrastructure matters on top of these containerized architectures is super important. Because what if I do have a recovery event? Right, if I look at my container pods, you know, if I lose one of the members of the pod, great, you know, it's HA and immediately comes up. But what if it's a more drastic issue that I'm having from a recovery perspective? Because again, containers, this whole idea is that they're ephemeral, right? They should be able to move all over the place, and that's great, but that might be a problem. So what is a container? To me, just to dumb it down, and there's some words up here on the screen, but to me, containerization is the step beyond virtualization. It's abstraction on top of virtualization. If you're comfortable already with the idea of a virtual machine and the ability for me to do software-confined compute and memory on an architecture, abstract it one more level up and push away the hypervisor. That's effectively what a container does. It takes the barest minimal wrapper around that specific enterprise app, and it can run anywhere that has the interface to be able to support that Docker containerization technology. And what that allows you to do is become very nimble with that capability. Very lightweight, standalone, it's an executable package, and Microsoft saw that coming specifically when they came out with SQL Server 2017. So they did all these new things in 2016. They brought in Polybase, column store, stretch database, all this cool stuff. They went from 16 to 17, and what was a big change? They abstracted SQL off of the tie with Windows Server onto Linux. I mean, you guys are starting to use Linux on SQL. A few people? Guys, it actually, in most instances, runs faster on Linux. As a matter of fact, the SQL code itself is fundamentally unchanged. So this changed the interface down to the OS. And again, we can go way in the weeds on that, but it's effectively SQL. And the ability for me to run it on Linux allows me to do this containerization pitch. Because while I could, in theory, run it on Windows containers, they're not quite ready for prime time. This is more of a Linux conversation. But the ability for me to be super nimble around that from a new era of data management becomes very live, very real. And we at Dell Technologies are embracing this very aggressively. So what's the idea? What does it actually look like? Well, here's some topology maps here that we have where we can look at, you know, what is that CSI, that storage container interface on this. I want to be able to do all of these things, right? I want to mount, unmount. I want to be able to dynamically provision. I want to take snapshots. And again, I said at the beginning, storage really matters. And using a technology like traditional SAN architectures, like what we have with Unity, what we have with Power, what we have with PowerMax, that becomes super important down here at that bottom layer, because that's the plug-in for the consistent volume to where I'm able to do things like all these orchestrators. And again, there's a number of them out there. It just seems like the critical mass is kind of gearing more towards Kubernetes. By the way, how many of you guys know what the abbreviation for Kubernetes is? Anybody? Down here. I saw your hand first. K8S. Okay, I'm going to give you a gift for that if you can tell me what the 8 means.
8.
Say again?
8 was from Kubernetes.
Not the sound. It's close. It is 8. 8 means 8, meaning that there's 8 letters between the letter K and the letter S in the word Kubernetes. Come on, guys. These are geeky guys that are... It's like the idea, Microsoft's talking about their next generation stuff. They codenamed it Tina. Do you know why they called it Tina? Their previous architecture was called Aries, I think it was. So Tina was, this is not Aries. I mean, slide the pizza underneath the door, right? Okay. So as we look at the architecture, Kubernetes seems to be the way that we're using it. There's multiple different flavors of Kubernetes that are out there. I've recently got some exposure to Rancher. I didn't really know much about them. This very interesting technology. Red Hat is a huge partner with Dell and using some of their Kubernetes orchestrators. All these things come in by leveraging these CSI plugins or their equivalent if you're using hybrid cloud or HCI components like Azure Kubernetes with AKS or Pivotal Kubernetes from a VMware perspective with PKS. That interface becomes really important because the orchestration of all of that with the applications on top becomes critically important around storage. Again, the guidance from Microsoft on the SQL side has been very, very specific. If you don't get the storage right, you're going to have a very, very bad day. So what is it? What is Kubernetes? Kubernetes and the visualization they had with Docker was the whale, so they called it pods. Well, that's kind of the idea. It's kind of a cluster idea to where I have multiple nodes based off of use case, and that's why it's visualized as different sizes, different instances. And this isn't necessarily SQL, by the way, just different applications that are being shared, and they're shared across the multiple nodes and controlled by that orchestrator, which is Kubernetes. It makes it way easier than to try to manage Docker and the individual containers themselves. And so the idea is with this instance of, again, leveraging Dell EMC storage like VxFlex, like PowerMax. There's a few instances that we have specifically around the CSI plugin. I have that integration to where I can keep that persistence through that CSI plugin down to the individual node. So then the layer above of that is my orchestrator, right? The Kubernetes piece over the top allows me to move nimbly those individual containers. That may easily be some type of big data cluster, or it could be an Azure database coming from what we were just talking about with Azure Arc, because I can land that wherever I have a containerized architecture. Again, these are all things that kind of crept up on us, but it makes a pretty significant game change of the way that we look at the architecture. From a Dell perspective, of course, we're not just services and working with software, but we have a long history from a hardware perspective. We've been working with Microsoft specifically for well over 30 years. And what we found is when we're looking at this new paradigm around data gravity and data virtualization and this holistic story, there's 3 fundamental ideas from a Dell perspective that we're really focusing on. Accelerate, protect, and reuse. Accelerate has to do specifically around all the amazing changes that are happening on the hardware and the hardware components. Protect has to do about what we talked about earlier. If I'm running a containerized architecture, SQL 2019 big data cluster, I have to have a backup recovery archive. I have to have some type of story of where I know that my data is protected when that event happens. And then the other really neat thing is the reuse perspective. The idea of where we're getting back into the idea of like gold master instances of the containerized SQL 2019 version to where I don't have to manage and patch and update hundreds or maybe even thousands of databases out there. That's a nightmare that most DBAs I talk to are dealing with today. I've got so many instances of 2008 and 2012 and 2016 and other non-SQL architectures, just patching them and updating them and keeping them supported around their underlying operating system, and I'm running so far behind, and I also have to be attributable to the apps and the analytics owner over the top. At some point, I'd like to be able to go to bed or kiss my kids. That's the scenario that we see with DBAs today, is how do I make that become a reality to where I'm not dealing with, just like we had the problem with the VMware sprawl, we're seeing the same idea in the database sprawl. There's so many different instances that are out there, it becomes nightmarish. And the whole idea that we're doing around specifically SQL 2019 is, I can run in compatibility mode. I don't have to support necessarily hundreds or maybe even thousands of instances when I can do it maybe in a dozen or less, and I keep pointing to that. And when I do my update with the container, I just collapse the container, point to the new container update, and set it right back up. The whole migration path within that Docker pod becomes actually quite easy for me to maintain, patch, and update around that containerization idea. Again, because that containerization wrapper removes me from all that underlying firmware and OS stuff that I used to have to be so mindful of. It abstracts me above all that. So from a DBA perspective, having an actual life and work-life balance becomes important on the reuse perspective. Let me start with Accelerate. How many of you are familiar with Intel and Optane? Have you heard that buzzword? Okay, who can tell me what are the two platforms that Intel Optane exists in today? I see a hand up. Kirsten, I don't know if we're going to be able to give them a gift, but let's find out.
So you're going for the vendors, you're saying?
No. The actual, what's the hardware? What's the Optane hardware? When you actually buy it, what actually is it?
Okay, so you have the
Two types of Optane.
Right, the persistent memory.
Persistent memory.
And Optane, DC,
SSDs, yes. Winner. Fantastic. So there's new technology that's come out beyond the technology that we've thought about for the longest time. You know, beyond spinning disk and flash with SSDs, NVMe, the new protocol. Intel with Optane took NVMe and it basically, I didn't say steroids, did the whole steroid event on that by using the Optane technology on top of NVMe with an SSD type architecture. Yes, that was good. But what they really did that was interesting around the naming convention around Optane was the whole idea of persistent memory. So I got the memory bus right next to the processor. It's ridiculously fast because the throughput that I have just right, historically I've always had that within a motherboard. Wouldn't it be great to put almost like a storage prime, not necessarily memory, but actually a tier of storage on that interface? And that's effectively what we see with persistent memory. So what that means is, I like to use analogies. It's Thursday. We can be silly, right? Here's my analogy. How many of you guys have seen the greatest movie in the world called Spaceballs? I mean, it's the greatest movie in the world. Okay, so Dark Helmet is chasing the Winnebago. I mean, be with me, guys. Be in the zone here. And he realizes that they went light speed. What does he do? He hits a button called ludicrous speed, right? They go so fast, they go plaid. That's what this is. Okay, almost. But now we're starting to measure databases in the nanoseconds. I mean, stupid fast, right? You're really running into true physics issues going much faster than this. We've done some testing. Granted, lab testing, you'll see hero numbers, but we're actually seeing this out in production as well, where customers are recognizing that I'm beating things up from a SQL perspective, or maybe I'm doing an app, like I'm beating it up with doing test dev with Dynamics. So that's a use case that I've run into recently, where they can't put enough horsepower behind it. They want to run faster and faster and faster because they're hitting these things so hard. So they're using this persistent memory within that architecture that's sitting right on that same bus, and it's effectively acting as a drive, for want of a better term, right? It's acting as a tier drive above even NVMe. And by doing that, I can put the things that require ridiculously fast latencies from all my log targets and all the things that I just need to be super fast. I'm dumping those there, and the performance numbers that we're seeing are just silly. I mean, they are. They're things that a few years ago were like, seriously, really? Yeah, really. And so that technology will continue to be enabled, but from an accelerate perspective, we're recognizing that as you're building your architectures, this is something you might want to look at. Now granted, this is not inexpensive. There is a price per performance conversation that we need to have, but for some of you that are looking for highly performant capability needs of running some high-end analytics on top of your infrastructure on premises, from an AI ML point of view, technologies like this are an enabler. And then as we go farther around, one of the things that we like to champion is the ability for us to even make it easier for you to manage infrastructure. So one of the things I have here up on the screen is we are injecting our open manage consoles into management tools like Windows Admin Center. How many of you guys are Windows Server and using Hyper-V within your environment? A few of you? SQL conversation. There should be a lot of that, right? And it used to be directly tied. SQL had to run on Windows Server. How many of you are using Windows Admin Center? 2? Should be a lot of you. Windows Admin Center comes with your Windows Server license. I'm not going to say it's free, but it's free. I mean, you already bought it, so use it. Windows Admin Center is the one ring to rule them all going forward. So when you're managing Windows, instead of managing 15 or 20 physical windows in your console, if you're managing Windows Server and all the different tools, Windows Admin Center consolidates them all into one console. And through that, I can then go connect into Azure services, and then very importantly, OEM partners like Dell, we inject an open managed plug into this. So I can manage in that single console all the way down to my bare metal. I can look at inventory regarding my compliance on firmware from an iDRAC perspective. This is true just for PowerEdge as well. It doesn't have to be hyper-converged architectures, but again, taking advantage of the technologies from an accelerate point of view is something that we're trying to make it even easier for you to get more performance. So there's the plug that we have on Open Manage. If you want to talk more about it, I'm happy to hit that. And then we get into Protect. The whole Dell Technologies story, Dell EMC is a huge part of it. I came from the Dell side versus the EMC side, but I was selling EMC going all the way back, 18 years ago. And it was a BURA story, B-U-R-A, Backup Recovery Archive. And you know what? That is still in play even today. And the idea of how do I protect my data, specifically as we look into the new technologies and these holistic platforms in which I'm using containerization technology, becomes super important because there is a layer cake of opportunity for me to address protection. I can protect from an application point of view using tools like SQL Always On. Most of you in the environment hopefully are familiar with that. When you go into SQL Enterprise Edition, the ability for me to do all kinds of replication, either local target or distance target with Always On, really, really cool technology. And from a DBA and an application owner, that might make sense. But there's also replication technologies that we see from a hypervisor perspective that is still of great value. You know, the idea of vMotion, of using what vSphere and Hyper-V has at the table, being able to leverage that, as well as storage level replication that we've been taking advantage of for some time. The question then comes, well, what do I do to do some kind of consolidation? And data domain is really the play that we have here, of having a protected architecture and all the ideas of a layer cake to where I can still take advantage and pick and choose what makes sense for me. For a lot of customers, it's going to be multiples of these at once. The storage administrator might be doing something specifically around storage replication. The DBA might be saying, I want to use Always On. Is it an or story? No, not necessarily. In many instances, it's an and story. But the ability for me to have some type of a common target to be able to look at a holistic recovery event. And oh, by the way, this isn't just about SQL. This is true for all types of applications with SAP, with Oracle, with Microsoft Exchange, with SQL. How do I address that recovery point of view from an accelerate, protect, reuse point of view? And then on the last one, I'm going to talk about reuse. So the goodness that we're seeing specifically around SQL 2019 and the idea of it being able to run in compatibility mode within the commonality of the engine, and the way that SQL 19 is actually being addressed and validated for the analytics and apps over the top of it, means effectively I can have incredible peace of mind for a DBA to where I have kind of like the idea we had for virtualization technology where you had gold copies, right? You would keep replicating off of that gold copy. That same idea to where I have a number of smaller pick your color of the rainbow copies that are my pristine versions, and I start pushing those out through replication and repurposing out to the DBAs for dev test, where they're actually able to touch the data but not fully in production. Those capabilities are really coming to advent now with SQL 2019 and the big data cluster, to where I can literally give them access to that data, and using tools like Always On and a few other things within that idea, but to where I have the DBA only managing a very discrete sets of my golden super, this is it. And instead of having to maintain hundreds or thousands of databases, because I'm containerizing that whole idea, all that chaff falls away because it's all abstracted within the container. And again, what that means for the DBA is you actually go get to watch the soccer game, because in the past that wasn't always the case. All right, we've talked for a while. My voice is still here, barely. I feel it hanging on. We got a couple other handouts that we want to hand out based off of good questions. I wanted to allow a little time. But what I want to make sure that I stress is, when we look at it, this new era of data management and this epical change, epic, E-P-O-C-H, epic, not epic like super duper, but not processors, but like the rise of the dinosaurs, right? So as we look at the changes happening with virtual machine technology, now coming up with the same idea of containerization, the recognizing event that we're having is there is no one right answer. It is absolutely a journey. And when you're sitting there in your back of your mind saying, Steve, that was interesting. However, I'm a vSphere shop, and I like to use a lot of vSAN, and you didn't talk a lot about that. And my answer is, we absolutely can, because there's a way for us to do that on that technology. Or you're like, Steve, we decided that the EMC product with PowerMax was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and we bought one of those about 3 years ago, and can we leverage that technology? And my answer is, absolutely, let's talk about that, because the ability for me to use things like CSI plugin comes into play. Or you could say, Steve, this is interesting. However, I'm a huge adoption model around public cloud. Everything is going up into AWS, and you didn't talk much about that, and I don't know why I'm here at Ignite. Well, okay. But the reality is that containerization story resonates there as well. Interestingly, Azure Arc supports that environment. You're running Azure in AWS? Yes, please. It's very interesting how all these things are coming together from a multi-cloud world. There's not one answer. And we have a fantastic partner. I see him right over there. Hi, Doug. We have a fantastic partner that is doing a bunch of different things like this. There's not just one answer here. Where I might want to use hyperconverged architecture to be my storage target for SQL 2017, and even looking at being early adopters around SQL 2019 and big data cluster. Next to that, I have Azure Stack, bringing Azure Stack Hub now, bringing Azure behind the firewall so I can do some Azure services on-prem. Meanwhile, I might also have an unstructured database sitting there on Isilon. The ability for me to address all of that data using tools like Polybase is something that can be a reality. There's not one architecture that makes sense. It is, I'm going to go back to my little meme guy, right? It's all the things. Containerize all the things. And that right there, it makes a lot of people's eyes cross. They're like, son of a gun, really? Seriously? Yeah, it's really not that hard if you get the storage right. But the ability for you to do all these cool things. By the way, when I look at the architectures that we're doing for SQL 2019 Big Data Cluster, and I kind of squint, I was like, man, that sure looks like Kafka and unstructured. It's almost the exact same architecture. Because it's all running off the same general idea, to where I have mixed-use environments off of a common architecture. Containerize all the things, data becomes democratized. Hey, we're really good at this from a Microsoft perspective. We have over a 30-year relationship with Microsoft. We're Microsoft's largest partner still. By the way, Microsoft is our largest partner. We tend to, internally at Dell Technologies, get real distracted with VMware, right? It's part of our umbrella of the 7 suites of product that we have. Who's our largest partner? Microsoft. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. We're deeply invested with them, and we have been for 3 decades. And the reality is nobody but Dell Technologies can address the entire suite of Microsoft platforms because all of our competition is segmented. They're not under one common architecture anymore. So whether you're talking about data in SQL, whether you're talking architectures from a client perspective, like with Office 365, when you're looking at support, when you're looking at migration services, when you're looking for security conversations and business resiliency, we're there. We have the expertise. We've been doing this longer than anybody. I've got 16,000 brothers and sisters at Dell that are focused on Microsoft services, whether that's support, deployment, or very importantly, consulting services. And we got all the competencies you can have. Microsoft keeps changing the number, but we got all of them. And we're deeply invested with them not only from a services perspective, but on the design perspective. So the reason why we were able to make that full stop about 9 months ago and peel back the layers of SQL 19 and say, guys, this is actually quite a bit different. This isn't just the next version. This is a pretty fundamental architecture redesign. It's because of our deep joint investment that we have within our individual product groups. So the reason why I can throw names out there like Buck Woody and Bob Ward and Travis Wright and some of the members of that team is because we're tied in with them. We spend time there up in Redmond. They spend time with us, not just in Round Rock, but a lot of our different data centers. When we start designing our SQL-ready solutions, it's based off of their input. And then we do the enablement technologies to make the music happen with tools like CSI and AKS and PKS to be able to support that. We got really aggressive on this about 9 months ago. So we are far ahead of our competition right now regarding white papers, regarding blogs, regarding aggressively embracing the idea around SQL Server 2019, big data clusters, and containerization. I wrote a blog myself a couple of weeks ago, hot off the presses, talking on exactly this conversation and how big of a deal we're seeing it from a Dell perspective. And it's not just SQL, by the way. We're seeing other similar stories with Oracle and SAP and unstructured architectures like Hadoop. So when you're looking at data and the criticality of data, and being at Microsoft Ignite, we're talking about Microsoft. But when there's a data conversation, reach out to us, ask us questions. We very likely have an opinion and to get the right resources together. All right, so I think back at our Dell booth down at the hub, we're doing one last drawing at 4:30 today for, it was the headsets, right? GoPro and the headsets. Hey, Christine. So we are doing one last drawing today. So if you haven't already entered after 4:30 yesterday or sometime today, you got the little stickers right here. So as you leave, we'll be able to get that in there. You just do a little stamp on each one of those. You have to be there at the drawing at 4:30, but it's the very end of the hub event, right before you get ready to put your Mickey Mouse ears. No, we're not going to Mickey Mouse. We're going to Universal. Right before you bring out your wizarding stick or the wand, right? The unicorn tail wand, right? Right before you do that and get on the shuttle bus to go to Universal Studios, drop by the hub and see if you might be able to win. Okay, got about a minute left. Any questions? Was this helpful? Was this interesting? Fantastic. Anything that you have a question about? Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful time at the Universal Studios. Thank you very much.